software engineers and was kind of coined a term AI vampire, not speaking about the computer being the vampire, sucking the blood of the human race.
Spoiler alert is that the cost of tokens or the cost of AI output is going down dramatically. And I'll share that here in just a second.
And this data center and space thing looks like a really real thing, plus solving a major block that's coming here. And
that shocked me that it was, 2.5 times. I mean, it was a lot more single females than single males that are out there buying homes in this market currently.
Episode 89 of the award-winning Market Moves with Mark and Jeff. Two uninteresting guys talking about interesting times. Not only are we uninteresting guys, but we are here for the greater good, sacrificing showering to save water for the data centers. Jeff, we are doing what it takes to make sure that we stay in the lead in the AI race here.
It's the beauty of a podcast is nobody knows and nobody cares whether it's been an hour or a week since you've showered last. And there's this ongoing, kind of battle about a big data center coming in the northern part of Utah, where I'm at. And water is this, this, I hear some describe it as a herring, like it's not really an issue when, they're operating at scale with a closed loop system or whatever. But boy, that seems to be the biggest talking point, the biggest point of contention. And, being in a desert and a dry area anyway, it just adds fuel, I think, to that concern of, is this thing going to suck all the water out of the region or whatever? And it, as far as I can tell, it's not. But my wife does insist I don't go too long without damaging the planet by taking my share of water for a shower, at least.
You record podcasts. Nobody knows if you showered or wear pants, right? Those are the two secrets that we get to keep. But that it is kind of an interesting segue. That is a little bit of a show upkeep, I guess, or behind the curtains thing. The Market Moves content creation is growing a little bit with a newsletter companion. So for those listeners that have trouble listening every week or would prefer a written medium, we are putting together and have started actually this week, putting together a newsletter that highlights each of the topics that we discuss here on the show, kind of cover Jeff and I's input and takes on each of those. And also a thread called Tugging at the Thread, which is, speaking of these data centers and the water problem, we spoke at length about this on our last episode. And this topic is kind of interesting to me. And Tug decided to pull at that thread of discussion and wrote an awesome article, which every time we will read and sort of curate and make sure that it is worth reading and worth publishing, but and maybe edit where we think possible or necessary. But it just goes deeper into what we talked about, researching other articles, other commentary, and data points to add more depth to the discussion on the show. I was impressed as heck, Jeff. We spent, all of 24 hours building that. I think there's even some statements that we could talk about with OpenClaw and these artificial agents just sort of running off a single prompt there. We watched a lot of that happen. So yeah, newsletter, Jeff. Maybe we can show on the screen here the landing page. We will, of course, have a link in the show notes. I believe you'll be able to search this. We have used Beehive, but it's Market Moves Weekly. Beehive.com. And so we'll have the link in the show notes here, but give that a watch or a subscribe, I guess, and you can get the Market Moves information a little bit other way.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun pulling this together. I mean, seeing some of the logistics of how it's worked with Tug really taking the lead on it. And, I think, so from a productivity perspective, you and I probably, we certainly wouldn't have a newsletter today if it wasn't for the lift and the help. I find this interesting thing happen sometimes. Sometimes somebody will be doing something interesting with AI and will say, hey, look at this. I push this button and it will give me all of this output or feedback or create an article or whatever. And it's like, yeah, that's cool. But it's not like you really put anything into it. And I think to just double click on what you were talking about, Mark, the whole premise around the newsletter is going to be topics that we cover, curated, by us, reviewed by us. Certainly, I mean, it's certainly not trying to pretend that it's not, augmented by and lifted by, Tug as our agent, but it's a lot more than just a simple, at least the way we anticipate it, is it's a lot more than just a simple push the button, tell it to do something, and then we give zero, additional thought to it or whatever. One of the things I liked in the first letter that it did was it gave a summary of each of the topics that we covered in kind of a bullet point with a brief summary format that was easy to digest. And my hope is that it will allow people to assess, what topics am I interested in? Do I want to double click and find more information on those or not, without listening to the whole episode to get to what we maybe happen to talk about at the end of it or something. So a lot of fun. We're testing, experimenting as we go, and trying to exhibit a bias for action, do something and make it exist first and then make it better, to borrow from Elon's mantra on life. But been a lot of fun, and we're hoping to have it be content that's valuable enough that people will actually want to check it out and stay up to date with it.
Jeff, we have so much to cover on the show. The first of 6 topics are going to be kind of AI related, and I think it is worth standing on this topic for a second here and just talking about the OpenClaw effort, Tug, which is our OpenClaw agent, and what we've been doing. You and I have, I'd say, been distracted as it relates to the OpenClaw agent. Understandably, this is not our day job, and so we got it stood up, working well, doing some things. I'm a little bored by the social media posts that he's putting out often. I think we have opportunity to provide more insight to those, but we've been a little stagnant for a month or so, and we jumped back in, having desk time yesterday, and I mean, we just put this idea together of the newsletter. Said, hey, why don't you write us a newsletter? In kind of based off of our transcriptions, let's take a look at the beginning of that. Where would we go to publish this newsletter? Beehive was one of many, Substack another, suggestions. And as soon as we got a login, yet another SaaS subscription that we have given to our digital butt in a seat. But from there, we just watched and guided this thing for the better part of 2 hours, building and standing this up from a number of different aspects. And so we had set aside, Tug, doing some good work for us, for sure, that we sort of set in place, but have come right back to it. And I have to say, I think he improved in the month hiatus. While we were on hiatus, he was not. The developers building OpenClaw made it better. There were some pretty impressive skills, like, oh, I need to do this next. I don't have the skill to do that. Let me go download it. Oh, I just downloaded it. Yep, that's working great. All those sorts of things. It was pretty amazing to see.
Yeah, and as you described that, Mark, maybe at one point it'd be fun to do even like a show and tell or a working session, because the thing that's so fascinating is that process you've described, and it's easy to, maybe skim over or take it for granted, but in the messaging app that we're using to communicate, he's posting like these updates. It's kind of like watching your chatbot in thinking mode, just showing you what it's thinking or steps it's taking. But he's sending very specific messages saying, I need this, now I've got it, now I'm doing this. And what's interesting for me is with the computer that he resides in, with his penthouse suite, sitting on my desk, and the monitor that shows everything, I see him taking those actions on the computer. That there are some skills, Chromium and Playwright and others that I've never had reason to know about before this effort, but that basically allow it to interact with websites and with YouTube and with Beehive, setting this up and everything. But to see him telling you what it's doing, but then also watch it actually happening on the screen, it's just been fascinating. It's a lot of fun, and something that actually took productive action and gave us an output in a way that otherwise you or I would have had to sit down and go through the whole setup process ourselves. And we guided it, we tweaked some things. You had some good stylistic recommendations on the landing page to change colors and fonts, but it wasn't going into the website and doing that itself. It was telling Tug, change this, tweak that, and him actually being able to go into Beehive and make those even just stylistic changes that were all just fascinating to watch, unfold in the course of an hour or two.
Jeff, I'm this conversation is leading us to go to just kind of the artificial intelligence trending that we're seeing here, based on what we just saw before we get into the data center situation monitoring that you and I are doing from our comfortable office chairs. But every time there are many, but two people that I really enjoy hearing being interviewed are Marc Andreessen and Gavin Baker. I have not gotten to the Gavin Baker interview, but he just did another one. But Joe Rogan had interviewed Marc Andreessen and released it this week, and a number of things there. This is sort of obvious, but when this newsletter example with OpenClaw leads right into something that he was talking about, like how this thing is scaling. I think he made the comment that AGI was probably reached sometime late last year. And what is the definition of artificial general intelligence? I don't really know. And I think the specifics don't really matter. But what does certainly matter is that we are in the middle of this trend everybody is scared of, this full paradigm shift in the world. There's no doubt. We're 2 or 3 years into it. We are moving in the direction, and the flywheel is beginning to spin. But one thing that he talked about with these software engineers, and was kind of coined a term, AI vampire, not speaking about the computer being the vampire sucking the blood of the human race. That was not it, actually, but it's the software engineer, and so the explanation first is that engineers, this is the furthest advancement of AI at this point, right? That's really what has kind of changed the game here over the last 6 months. And so, of course, a software engineer can be 10 or 20 times more productive. What is not happening is the software engineer working 1 or 2 hours a day and just getting the same amount done in the day. That is not the human lived experience over the last, 5,000 years. That isn't how we work. It seems that when we are able to do more with less, we end up doing more. And so there is this sort of like adrenaline rush with these programmers, the autists out there. I'm not one of them. I sort of wish I was at times, but they're, the AI vampire is the guys that just can't sleep because they're so excited getting all of their ideas rolled out, where they've had ideas forever and it just took too much to get done. And so they're spending all this time doing this and just thrilled, and the OpenClaw scenario with this newsletter is just one example. So Andreessen described it as, this is how it is scaling. You've got the software engineer that now, this wasn't necessarily the case, but now can, with a thoughtful prompt, say, go build me this. And that thing can go away for 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, whatever it is. Well, what does the software engineer do in those 1 or 2 hours waiting for the completed product to give feedback on? Well, he could just sit there and go grab a coffee or something, but that's not what they do. They go start another agent on another issue, and then another agent, to where they have 20 agents going at once. That kind of is where we are right now. Describing, I think it was OpenAI or Meta software engineers getting paid $50 million a year right now. That's where we are right now. But the next iteration then is that software engineer has 20 AI agents who each have 20 AI agents, and we've seen OpenClaw spawn sub-agents for different larger products that we have. And so you can see this enormous thirst for tokens and intelligence, sand being turned into human thought. And now that we are getting access to it, there's infinite use, it seems. So long-winded, but that seems to be the state of things, and it's really interesting for just ordinary, uninteresting guys like you and I. It kind of can get a little taste of what's happening on a much larger scale when we're messing around with this OpenClaw stuff.
Absolutely. And it's fun to hear him describe what that experience is. The reason they refer to them as vampires is, that they just can't sleep. They literally are sleep deprived because, just like you laid out, they're not just, taking naps in between, waiting for a single agent to go run a program and then come back and report, but they're constantly giving feedback and so excited about they can't sleep. But he describes, knowing people who look terrible. They literally look sleep deprived and look like they're in bad shape. And I mean, we're not at that level, but I get a sense of that, as you and I are sitting down and making real progress with something. It's like, well, crap, we don't want to stop. And yet, the day job and the demands of the day definitely start to mount. And so, we just don't have a choice but to stop and then, tend to all the rest of the business of the day. But man, you certainly get a sense of, it'd be a lot of fun to just keep pushing on and pursuing the thing that we're making progress on. It's a roller coaster of emotions. I mean, it can be incredibly frustrating. We had some of those conversations too, or why isn't he remembering this thing that we, told him just yesterday or whatever? And so it's poking and prodding and asking the question, well, why aren't you remembering this in the context of what we're talking about? So there's a lot of learning. There's definitely, highs and lows with it, but there is definitely a bit of an addictive factor to, just making the progress that wasn't achievable, without this kind of technology and agent that just facilitates, the output being so much, more prolific than it would have been or was even just in short history.
I think it was the philosopher Joe Rogan on a different podcast that was describing, one of the most defining traits of the human race is our desire and ability to just make things better, like all throughout history and time. And it's kind of an interesting, like macro perspective of what we are and what we do. But I mean, when you think about that, I mean, it's an adrenaline rush when you see that you can make things better more. I mean, that's kind of what's going on. And you and I are experiencing that just with ours. There are these moments of adrenaline rush that you say, like, holy crap, little old me can do this, who had no training on this whatsoever. And it's all the more exciting that you kind of hear a lot of people saying, look, this thing programs better than I do. And Andreessen mentioned John Carmack, the guy that created Doom, like a really well-known multi-decade software programmer, saying it codes better than I can, and I don't need to write code here. And if you walk through some of these AI labs, I heard some others, you'll hear whispers into a microphone from the engineers. That is the interface in the sound of productivity and development with AI, is talking back and forth quietly amongst multiple cubicles, getting things done. I need to hear that, like what an interesting scene and how different.
I wonder if we could talk our way into one of those labs just to experience or witness it. But one of the interesting things, and here's maybe a little nugget, I've downloaded and started using WhisperFlow, and the name's interesting, whatever. It's just literally voice to text translation or transcription. The name was interesting, but hearing you describe that, Mark, it makes sense. And it does literally have like a whisper mode where if you're in a cubicle or you got people around you and your input has to be quieter so you're not distracting or prompting somebody else's input, like it's literally like optimized around doing that. But for writing appraisal reports, transcribing emails, sending internal messages, I found that it's a lot better than what a lot of transcription services have been in the past. And so it's been a meaningful, productivity lift for me. I just like typing in the first place. Mm-hmm. But, the name of that makes a little more sense, thinking about where it's likely, bred out of and most heavily utilized was just kind of an interesting insight.
Well, all of this leads to like the demand for token usage, just exploding all throughout. And we've got a graphic that Jeff, you had made some observations of, which actually, why don't you walk us through that graphic and your initial thoughts on it?
Yeah, for sure. So as we're talking about agents and then agents spawning agents all doing work, I mean, this all comes down to literally consuming energy, and AI tokens is kind of the unit of measure of output as these systems happen. One of the things I like, and there's kind of two prongs to this this setup, I think. The spoiler alert is that the cost of tokens or the cost of AI output is going down dramatically, and I'll share that here in just a second. But in order to get to that, I thought that'd be interesting. I wonder if I could find a chart about that. And so I put in the prompt into multiple LLMs that I like using, and I still kind of find it fun to put the same prompt into various chat bots, Claude, Gemini, Chat. I'm spacing on another one that I found that I like, but put the same thing in and just see what the output is. How are they similar? How are they different? A little bit of kind of the mixture of experts, in part to try to assess, is one of these hallucinating or are they all directionally telling me the same thing? And so I did that here. And this first output is what Gemini came up with. just interesting to measure the baseline in token cost. So if the token cost in March of 2023 was 100% or was, kind of the baseline, it's gone down dramatically. So from March of 23 to November of 2023, it went down 50%. It went down it was down to 16.5% of the baseline cost in May of 2024. So just over a year down the road. It's down, looking at May of 2026, to 2.5% of what the same cost was in March of 2023. I've heard, this concept discussed a lot of token cost is going to go down. There's probably, if it's not totally unlimited, there's a very vast demand for AI output in, as measured by tokens, but for coding, for answers, for, taking action on on your behalf through agents. All of these things lean on LLMs that are generating tokens. And so, this cost has dropped dramatically, from what it was as measured in March of 2023, according to what Gemini had put together. I asked Claude to do the same thing, and kind of a similar story and trend and trajectory. It started in November of 2022. It drops dramatically through May. It gives kind of a projection of where it's going, but November 2022 for 1 million tokens of output, $20 was the cost. By October of 2024, that $20 had gone down to 7 cents. For the same level of output, million tokens. And it's projecting by 2030, another 90% reduction in cost. And this really, in a lot of ways, is the story of technology. I mean, you think about, what you paid for a big screen TV or for a phone that had far less, functionality and application when they first came out versus the vast improvements and the lower incremental cost in most cases. Maybe the iPhone's not a great example because those suckers keep, are expensive and keep, staying expensive. But what they can do, by relative standards has gone up dramatically. So there's this underlying deflationary story and effect that, that this stuff has. And, I think clearly that trend is projected to continue going forward. But it was just really interesting, Mark. It's just one of these things where we're talking, question comes up, prompt a couple of chat bots, and just get really interesting insight. They kind of quantify what you've already conceptually understood to be the case, but a lot of fun, very insightful in my perspective.
I think it's Moore's law that says for every doubling of unit production in the tech space, the cost gets reduced by half or something like that. And maybe it's 10%. I don't remember exactly, but it's the same sort of thing that you're talking about. And I've seen a lot of people talk about Moore's law not being extreme enough in the AI space that we will be going this way. So it's getting cheaper, great. But we had Anthropic running into capacity limits, and OpenAI is having the same thing. This is the joke about Jeff and I not showering to save water. We've got this push against building data centers, and it's a real problem. Just yesterday, we have the SpaceX IPO S1, which is the documents leading up to I think an expected IPO on June 12th. And this data center and space thing looks like a really real thing, plus solving a major block that's coming here. And Anthropic sure seems to feel that. And I heard someone talking about the SpaceX IPO and saying that SpaceX has taken one of, if not its largest competitors, and made it a customer, which is Anthropic, and selling the $1.25 billion a month through 2029 is the contract that Anthropic has reached, and they're, I think, projecting it to grow. I mean, the thirst for this is great, and Anthropic is way in the lead. And I think Anthropic says, man, I've got all the momentum in growth right now to kind of catch and surpass OpenAI. I can't impede that growth. I've got to make sure that it's there. So they're winning the race as it seems right now, but secured the compute for the near term. And I think there's a lot of talk about kind of orbital compute that they're trying to reserve by getting this contract in place. So Jeff, and we have the slide of the United States, which is just kind of showing the data centers and the grid and the connectivity. And you had made the comment that this sort of looks like the brain synapse in connective nerves. and it all kind of seems and goes back to these sorts of things. But there are problems here, earthly problems at getting these things stood up, and they're bureaucracy problems more than anything. And we've got to solve that, worldwide, it seems. So I don't know. It's just a crazy world, and we've paraphrased people calling this sort of a game of kings, and it definitely sees that. You see people spending, $50-100 billion building these plants and all of this, really not knowing where they're going with any of it. But sure enough, they are finding, if there is compute that is powered, people have a deep thirst for it, even contracting with their, some of their biggest competitors.
Yeah, the really interesting relationship there between Anthropic and SpaceX. Really needing the real world atoms, like the actual data centers and physical compute and electricity to make that happen. So there's that aspect of it that was fascinating, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think it's 40 or 50% of all of the proposed data centers end up getting shut down because of the opposition to that. We've discussed that a little bit in a previous episode. So the concept of taking this to space, I mean, it sounds crazy and futuristic, and here we are living in the future. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised by that. But that really eliminates a lot of the bureaucratic and political pushback on I don't want this in my backyard. The NIMBYism thing that we talked about recently as well. Well, if it's in the sky over my head and I can't see it, and I don't have any political influence over that happening or not, it takes a lot of that out. But right now it's all built here on Earth, and and those projects are continuing to go forward and will likely be a meaningful part of the infrastructure well into the future. But this concept of taking this to space, fascinating as well. But this chart was just interesting to me, Mark, the build out that's already there, and this was as of November 2025. And there's a big project that I referenced here in my home state that seems to be going forward, but definitely meeting with a lot of this opposition we've been discussing. I think it will probably end up getting done, but the impediments to building this out, I think the political ones, the personality ones go away. There are definitely physical and physics challenges with doing stuff in space where you don't have air and you don't have certain components, for cooling that are necessary. But if anybody's up for the job, I suspect Elon is.
So Jeff, I'll do my best here. And this is certainly a passion topic for you and I think for a lot of the world, and certainly for business folks and like futurists generally that are just watching. So we spend a lot of time, but how on earth does any of this tie back to real estate? For the one, I think specifically, I saw someone make this comment yesterday. I think it was on X, that the price of land in this world where AI kind of feeds into real world AI and, like a robotic element to building and all of that, the price for land is finite and could be expected to rise a lot. But I wonder how that compares to the price for improvements, if you can build improvements much less expensively going forward, and so one, I think all of this has this larger impact, provided this intelligence, artificial intelligence, moves into real world and some sort of robotics that can do some work there. We're getting pretty far out there, but I don't think we're that far out there in timeline of this possibly being the case. So that has an impact, and then the fast advancement in agents and LLMs and next word guessing being more useful. The industries that are most in danger are those that look for a definitive answer where there is a definitive answer. Medical diagnoses and appraisal opinions or purchase prices are much more subjective and don't lead to that. And so I think we remain protected for a little bit here because this subjectivity, there just aren't good solutions for that right now, as far as I can tell. So I think we're a little bit protected in the moment, but you think about all the industries that are going to be deeply impacted. It's just a lot.
It's a good point. Yeah, that really is. And it is part of what Andreessen talked about with Rogan is when there are known right or wrong answers, math equations, for example, and even referenced engineering, like does the bridge or the building hold up or not, once it's built. Those are easier for AI to augment or displace. Things where there's not a definitive only one right answer. It still relies on the human judgment component and aspect, medical space, real estate in many ways. And also, I don't know where this ends up in the long term, Mark, but I continue to observe that there still is value in human relationships and interactions. People still want the human connection. And so, does my real estate agent lean on AI in a lot of ways? Probably, if they're going to be provide the best service that they can. But I still see people wanting to do business with people in a lot of ways. And so I don't see AI, totally replacing that.
The story making the rounds in the interwebs over the last week has been someone kind of taking 80 Pizza Hut franchises and kind of bringing back the pizza buffet and the stained glass Pizza Hut lamps and the salad bars and all that sort of stuff. And a lot of people have been excited at least to go there once. It certainly brings back fond memories for this old guy. But you do that. But man, I don't know. I mean, same time, I think in the last 24 hours, West Marine, a major boat seller, filed for bankruptcy, and Camping World filed for bankruptcy. Each of those entities, I think one had $1 billion in debt, the other $3.5 billion in debt, just total messes. We've got the first world woman recession being forecasted by Lululemon, Nike, Starbucks being down. There was another one, I forget what it was, but all those are down right now. So there is a lot of winners and losers right now being decided in these fast changing worlds.
Well, that's definitely one of the underlying themes is just the rate of change increasing as well. And it's tough to keep up with. I mean, in fact, that was another thing that Andreessen talked about is if you're not using the cutting edge models, you don't even know what the changes are or how much better they've gotten. And they're changing so quickly. You really have to be to stay up to date with it. And I found it worth spending, some money on a few of these subscriptions to try to stay up to date with the cutting edge models. And, you started the show talking about it a little bit, like you sense the improvement, month over month as they make new releases. They're not immaterial still. So it's kind of a lived experience as far as that goes.
You bet. Well, Jeff, let's jump into some major ongoings here with newly confirmed Kevin Warsh. We have an upcoming Fed meeting in the middle of June. His flowers for getting the actual confirmation are a disaster of a 10-year and 30-year Treasury or bond market, just skyrocketing. And it's just interesting on a whole number of levels, directly impacting our market. The real estate market is sort of putting along. I think maybe lifted by the spring and early summer markets, just kind of carrying through. Nothing over the top, but just sort of sitting there. But there is a news story while these bond rates are going through the roof, really in large part tied to energy instability, I think. And you've got the petroleum reserves around the world depleted at this point. Really notable here that I think it is somewhere around June 20th is sort of a date of no return or point of no return with the oil shortages that, so everybody has sort of been filling the gaps with their reserves, using the reserves one way or another. But if this thing carries through to June 20th and we don't start putting supply back on the market, there are long-lasting effects that cannot be corrected, just deep impacts to supply chains for all the things that, not just gasoline or whatever, but all the things that petroleum products are used for, fertilizers and plastics and all. And so we are getting close to that. And I think the market is reacting to that because nobody really understands, but it doesn't seem like there's a lot of progress as it relates to the U.S. and Iran and negotiations one way or another. And so I think markets are kind of having to deal. I mean, there's long-term structural bonds changes, like how much Japan and China want to hold. I think it is less than it used to be. But there are also short-term emergency needs. And so I got to sell, I got to get some cash and get through some of this this problem that is created by the Strait of Hormuz closure. So it's just a lot going on, and it's really created a lot of concern that we maybe don't see rate cuts, but could see rate increases by the end of this year. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, and a lot of this was spurred by the latest CPI, read that came in at 3.8%. It had been trending towards the Fed's desired 2%, hadn't actually gotten there, but boy, has really reversed course. Primarily on the back of increasing oil prices, and then all of the the kind of knock-on effects that has throughout the economy, from shipping to production. It drives costs up generally. It's interesting too, Mark, because President Trump went and met with Chinese leadership, with President Xi and others, came back, no real movement in the markets. I mean, hopefully productive conversations that lead to, good long-term outputs, but no, nothing major there. No real major progress with Iran and the Strait of Hormuz, as far as, like trending to, we're about ready to get this opened up and alleviate those concerns. So we're sitting here, and because we're sitting here with no real solutions eminently on the horizon, I think traders, I think bond investors are looking at this and concerned. It's definitely driving up those costs. And, there's that contingent of people on the one hand. On the other, you've got you and me and all the other, just everyday people who you can't, even if you wanted to, you can't help but drive down the street and see what gas prices are. And it have this, kind of psychological effect that further impacts people's psyche and willingness to spend. And I wonder if some of that is maybe tied to the Lululemon and Nike and like pullback in how they're doing, because people see how much more it costs to fill up my car with gas, today than it did last week or last month. And I think that they start to change their habits and behaviors there. In fact, I was doing some mental math on this, and if it used to cost me $65 to fill up my my pickup truck, and now it costs me $100, that's meaningful. It's not immaterial. Even if I have to fill it up 3 or 4 times in a month, if I'm driving a lot, the overall impact, like the dollar and cents impact, is meaningful. But in terms of like the monthly budget, it's it's probably not as impactful literally as it is psychologically, because you just know that it used to cost me less. I see posted every single day how much it costs. And when that trend continues to go up, which it still has been, it just has a psychological effect on many consumers throughout the country. And all of these things, lead towards, I think, concerns of ongoing inflation, people pulling back on spending, and it's resulted in interest rates going higher. So it's interesting to see how some of these dots connect. It's such an interwoven economy that it's hard to feel like you've mastered everything that's happening and cause and effects. But that's one that seems pretty obvious to me as I look at it.
If you could pull up the Scott Bessent. So
Yeah.
what do we take from all this? What do we think is going to happen? I mean, that was a nasty CPI read, not entirely surprising for many, although I think a lot were hoping it wouldn't be that high, but energy prices are through the roof. Bessent on inflation. So I see the administration here using what is now a dirty word, transitory. I feel like there is more evidence for it being transitory in this case than it was in 2022 or whenever that was with the crazy COVID stuff. But it would seem that the administration believes there is an exit ramp right around the corner. I don't understand why they would think that. Nothing that is publicly out there would seem to indicate that. Iran is nowhere near giving up their nuclear materials and whatever, all the other things that are there. But you can see Bessent here this week saying, look, 1 or 2 more hot prints, then substantial deflation. We get a series, 1 or 2 more of these hot numbers, then I think we're going to see the substantial decrease. And, so if it's transitory, there's a lot of panic right now unnecessarily. I would imagine Warsh and crew and Governor Crew are going to be sitting back and watching this, and 1 or 2 hot prints does a rise not make, in Fed run fund rates. And so I think that's probably where we are right now. we have talked about this multiple times on the podcast, that he kind of went on a press tour setting up that we need to be considering the deflationary impacts of what we spent the first 20 minutes on this podcast talking about, all the artificial intelligence stuff. Just yesterday, this sort of stoic, dystopian firing practice, not fire, layoffs from Facebook or Meta, where everybody was meant to work from home at 4 a.m. 8,000 people got a "you are dismissed" termination letter. The rest that are there, I read, are getting AI monitoring installed on their computers, and sort of a move to push AI at the center of corporate management and strategy, much like Jack Dorsey with Square talked about and sort of initiated not long ago. So, there is deflationary things going on. Whether it's enough to outweigh the inflation, I don't know. But so what do we do with all this? I don't know. I am not panicked on thinking of a Fed fund interest rate right now. I think we just need more data. I think the administration believes that this Iran deal there is an exit ramp that they are seeking. So that's what I make of it right now. And Jeff, we've got the Warsh talking about maybe a new emphasis, an emphasis on a new inflation metric that is not what the Fed has traditionally relied on.
Yeah, exactly. And interesting to see, if that actually gets put into place and becomes the new metric, because, taking out some of the most volatile expenses on both sides of the equation there, would have it more normalized. And I can see the case, for that. He's definitely, arguing for that to be the case. At the end of the day, you've got to have credibility in, the chairman of the Fed, in the Fed as the institution itself, and in the metrics that they're using. And so if the perception, even if not reality, but if the perception is they're cherry picking data and data points to tell the story that they want, that becomes problematic in the long term. And I'm not in this moment accusing him of doing that. I don't yet know enough to expect that to be the case. But, it's interesting to see what his perspective is on, are we even measuring the right thing as it relates to inflation? And should we be looking at a different gauge or not? So it's a really interesting discussion, and I think thing to think about. Does the target and does the metric by which we get to the target change? Because I've also heard some speculation that maybe 2% isn't the right inflation target long term, and should that be different? And you layer that on with these inflationary aspects in the moment, with the deflationary components in the economy that we've been talking about. In my mind, Mark, I think some of these things that are inflationary can be transitory if they're short term and if they're quickly overcome. And my guess is that when Powell was using that description early on in COVID, that probably was a legitimate expectation that we've got an outbreak, we're going to resolve it, and this will be transitory in the sense that we're not dealing with the same influences and impacts into the future. Well, you layer on the government's response to money printing to try to overcome a lot of the shutdowns, and it exacerbated the situation to where you had pushing 10% inflation rate prints, and it became a massive problem to have to deal with, and problems we're still trying to fully get overcome with. Here I don't know how that plays out, and we got a couple of things potentially moving at once as it pertains to the Fed, but interesting to see how that comes together.
Yeah, I think first, like anything, it's good to question. Okay, the Fed was using a certain inflation metric. They are thinking about using something different. That isn't automatically bad. Also not automatically good, right? Traditionally, personal consumption expenditure indexes are running at 3% over the last little bit. In this trimmed PCE, personal consumption expenditures, it just removes the lows and the high outliers, and it's not one category from month to month. It is just the outlier movements from month to month to try and get a more normalized deal, and not to over account for large swings that maybe, I guess the assumption would be, more transitory. So trim PCE, I think, worries a lot of people because it is just, I don't know, 0.6% lower, 2.3% instead of 3. So I think everyone is assuming that 2% inflation rate is going to continue to be the target. I don't know if it is or not. If you use the trim PCE, does the inflation target change? We just don't know. And so there's a lot of different things to consider when we're looking at this. So I think I feel pretty comfortable that the Fed could improve in the data that they're looking at. I think I know enough from what we've been studying over the last 2 years here. What the right things to look at, I can't tell you, but so it's a fresh look. It's a go. Nobody wants a sock puppet of any administration, and certainly not this one. So it can't be that. I am assuming a prerequisite for a nomination from Trump was an initial lowering of rates. I think Kevin Warsh and many others will do that, not because Trump wanted them to, but because the pre-qualifying requirement was that they truly believed that needed to happen, on their own accord. So here we sit, here we wait. More uncertainty. I think this war and oil prices are creating. We'll sit and wait with the rest of them. But I think a lower interest rate environment in the second half of the year is much more in jeopardy than it was before the word Strait of Hormuz entered our vernacular.
I'll be happy to not have to hear about that at some point. I hope it's sooner than later that actually comes to pass. And so much seems to hinge on that. I mean, I hope that isn't the case going forward. I wish that it weren't in the moment, but it sure seems like without resolution there, you're going to continue to see elevated oil and energy prices, and that just carries through the economy and through interest rate expectations. So here's to hoping that it doesn't. I was going to ask you, Mark, I like that infographic that you came up with. Where did you find that on the internet?
Oh, that was Grok. Just said, hey, I'd like an infographic that does this sort of thing. I noticed a misspelling as we were talking here, and you left it up a little long, so I'm sure everybody else that's watching noticed it as well. But I mean, the LLMs are getting stronger. That is something that ChatGPT has been doing all year. I don't have a premium subscription to that. I do to Claude and Grok, and so it's nice to see Grok finally catching up in that area.
Yeah, on some of the image creation. It's just fascinating what can be created, just by prompting in terms of infographics, images, all that sort of stuff. It was fun to highlight because normally I'd expect you find that on a website or something that somebody created and then posted, right? But just simply asking Grok, gave a pretty insightful little infographic.
So, Jeff, I think we are here to introduce maybe a recurring segment of the podcast, which is mansplaining single women trends in the U.S. Here's what I got. I got one trend for single women is that they are increasingly not watching this podcast. I think that is one a certain trend. And the second is this cohort is buying a tremendously high percentage of homes in the United States. And it is a strikingly divergent trend from historical norms. What do you see with that?
Yeah, well, first of all, it'd be really interesting to poll like the marital status, I guess, of those that listen to the podcast. But I suspect that you're directionally correct with that, Mark. So that interesting observation on that front. But as it pertains to people buying houses the way they're made up, I made this comment to you earlier. But if you were just to ask me, and maybe I should have brought this up before the spoiler alert that's on the screen. But, of the four kind of categories of people, married couples, single males, single females, and unmarried couples, who would you guess are buying the most homes, or of those categories, who has the biggest percentage of home ownership? I would, I'm knowing the data, but if I didn't, I would assume that married couples would be the highest percentage, unmarried couples would be the next highest percentage, and then single men and women would kind of split the lower half evenly. And that's not what we observe. Now, unsurprisingly, married couples do make up the contingent that buys the biggest percentage of housing at 50% of all homes bought are by married couples. Not a real shocker there. But the next contingent is 25% then comprise single females, and then it's single males at 11% and unmarried couples at 10% as kind of the remaining contingent of people that are buying homes. And that shocked me that it was 2.5 times. I mean, it was a lot more single females than single males that are out there buying homes in this market currently. I don't know that I'm qualified or equipped to mansplain anything to anybody, frankly. I don't even know exactly why it diverges the way that it does here, but just certainly not what I expected when we first looked at this.
Yeah, there are so many changing family dynamics and what is expected of each of these cohorts one way or another. We've talked a lot about, well, the delay in age of first-time home buyer. We've also talked about the decreasing age of first-time stock purchaser. There's clearly people starting families later, and I think the birth rates are way lower. So you got people doing far less. So I don't know. I think a thread that I would like to be pulling at a lot more, and we have reached out to several guests to try and have this discussion. So far, nobody's willing to take us up on it. We may need more likes and subscribes to the podcast to convince some of these high visibility guests to come on the show. But there's just the demographic and psychological changes of people that are buying real estate. It's shifted a lot, and I think will continue to shift for a lot of the things we've talked about on this podcast. Artificial intelligence changes. There are a lot of winners and losers being created out of all of this, and nobody can predict who's going to be a winner and who isn't. And on some level, if homeownership is describing a winner, and I think there are societal data points to point to that single females are winning, single males not winning as much. So I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. It is not what I expected. And I would have thought that unmarried couples would be a higher percentage than it is, in the moment. And, it wasn't very many episodes ago, Mark, that we were talking about, kind of that demographic, reality, but, some of the likelihood of success later on in life, being brought up in a home that's owned versus not. And certainly there are a lot of studies around, just family dynamics, setting up children for success or, lower likelihoods of success or whatever. So it's all interesting. It's fun and interesting to see what the trends, turn out to be when measured, from time to time. So that was interesting.
Jeff, as we were talking here, just as kind of a fun thought exercise, I was kind of putting these same 4 cohorts into a language model, saying who would be most likely to buy equities first. And interesting that trend is, I think, how you said you would have ranked the cohorts: married couples first, unmarried couples second, single males, single females. In that order was the more of a guess, not strong data points there from the language model. But so the housing demographic shifting, maybe a little less shift on the equity side as it relates to who's doing what.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I kind of figured that might be where you were going with that when you first started describing it, because that question, definitely comes up. And you've got the aspect of timing too. What were the ages of each of those cohorts buying the real estate versus the stocks? We've certainly seen interesting trends there, where more likely to be younger buying the equities, than the first-time home and real estate. So, we're nerds. What can we say? We enjoy looking at the different trends, the different demographics, and what's changing over time from what it has been historically. And certainly, some of these shifts are happening.
Jeff, to keep me honest, I wanted to check in really quickly on the Open Door stock price. This is one that I'm kind of excited about the mission and the changes. Like many things, and certainly in and around the home market right now, things don't look great with this possibility of interest rate rises. But I think I was buying this at $5.11 or something. I am not winning right now. I don't measure a win in the short term stuff, but just to keep myself honest here, wanted to note that it has had a really bad run since February, really, and but more specifically here with the inflation print and some concerns. I really liked their quarterly call a few weeks ago. It's going great. They are really executing on a number of fronts. Specifically changing the strategy to offering a bunch of discount offers to people and kind of inversely selecting bad properties. Like, people would only sell at that discount because they know something is inherently wrong with the property. So then Open Door takes forever to sell it. Instead, changing that to trying to get very competitive offers out there that they can turn around really quickly, and you reduce holding cost times, and then you change your brand to being good properties that you have in inventory and selling, and they are accomplishing that. Their number of acquisitions and contracts they're putting out is rising significantly. So they're humming on a lot of fronts here. I think the market isn't recognizing it. Of course, short term, it's a voting machine. Long term, it's a weighing machine, the stock market. And I really like where this thing is going. Not financial advice at all, but I think my bias will cover Open Door stock price at the beginning of the podcast when it's going well, and at the very tail end when it's not going well.
Well, if I at least know what your average cost is in it, Mark, anytime it's below that, I'll buy it just so that I can let my competitive juices flow and have a lower basis than you do. And knowing our luck, it'll trend to zero because of some weird management thing that nobody could have projected or seen come. And somebody else, some other iBuyer will end up winning the market in the day. But I mean, on a more serious note, it's really interesting to see what they're trying to do. And it still, to me, seems like there is a space in the market for that to facilitate, to ease, and eliminate some of the friction points of listing and selling a home that everybody's always just had to accept and deal with forever. And so, some of these changes and iterations that you've just described make sense from a business model perspective for me. And, if I'm not ready to sell my house today, but if I were, and I had an option that was Open Door on the table, and it was a competitive price relative to what I could go through the traditional marketing and showing and trying to time selling that house with what do I do while I build or buy or rent or whatever my next move is going to be. It sounds attractive to me. I mean, just as a consumer, out there in the space. So whether they're the ones that win the day or not, I don't know, but it sure seems that there's a pretty big addressable market for this iBuyer facilitate the real estate transaction that has historically not been, a very user-friendly or fun experience to go through.
You bet. I think vision and ability to execute are really what makes all this possible. And you just got to find someone that's got the right company, got the right vision and the ability to execute on that vision. And they can learn from those that haven't succeeded, right? Those are necessary to get to the right sweet spot there. So, well, Jeff, that'll do it for us. Two guys sacrificing for the good of humanity, showering less, and trying to bring the AI overlords to homes near you.
And having a good time doing it in the meantime, Mark. It's a pleasure as always. We'll keep reporting on what we're finding, and we'll talk next week.
Take care.